And when I see these big linemen as an example, who have these big honking calves and these big quads and big butts, my question is, how do you move side to side? How do you move in rotation? And what happens if you have somebody who does a sidestep or a spin? How reactive are you going to be? When we look at gaining the strength, you're gaining the stability. I think everybody agrees with that.
Mm-hmm.
What happens though if we can use the analogy of having that strength and using it in 3 planes of motion, or think of that powerful thick rubber band? What kind of recoil do you have and explosiveness if you can't get that rubber band to stretch and load very well?
Right.
You know we're not getting much power out of it. But if you take that rubber band that has good power behind it and you load it, you're going to see a lot more explosive reaction to it.
Mm-hmm.
Every athlete, I don't care what sport, I don't care what position, every athlete that has gone through a traditional strength training program and then been able to take them through 3 planes of motion and mobilize them, they become more powerful, more explosive, and have gotten stronger because we have allowed now the tissue, and the tissue not just being the muscle, Michol.
Yeah.
There's a lot of data and research out there now about the fascial system and how the fascial system is creating this integrated matrix of this integrated interrelationship of from distal to proximal, proximal to distal, from one end to the other.
Yeah.
Load that system, we're seeing that the fascia is also starting to actually contract. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that you don't have to load the muscle tissue as much as we used to think, because we're getting that elasticity not only out of the tissue, but out of the fascia as well.
And
let me just say one more thing. When we think that every muscle and every joint in the body works in 3 planes of motion, we need to harness that energy, because we store 3 to 9 times more energy when we eccentric load than concentrically unload.
Mm-hmm.
All 3 planes of motion, and get those relationships to increase the mobility, which will increase the loading and that elasticity.
And I think, Simon and Bennett and I were on a discussion last week. We talked about the metabolic gain from starting to share the responsibility of motion amongst more tissues than simply just the muscular system. And, metabolically, we would say that the muscular system is the most energy expensive system we have. It consumes the most energy. Of the muscular system, concentric force productions is the most energy expensive of the contraction phases of the muscular system. So we could arguably say that concentric force production is the most expensive phase of the most expensive tissue of the body, followed by eccentric, followed by isometric. And so, if we can share the responsibility of having the tissues share the responsibility, using, like you said, the elastic nature of other tissues like connective tissue, then, that decreases the burden of all the metabolic exchange that we would otherwise use for just a muscular force production. We see that a lot with running efficiencies. But if we kind of anchor this back to strength, if I can actually create a strong elastic response and storage, that actually propels me with much more fluidity and much more amplitude than simply just a concentric force production in the muscular system alone. And you deal a lot with pitchers. And if we think about the velocity in the pitchers or golfers, much of it in terms of power production, the ability to exert a force, let's say against the ball throwing or against a ball when you hit it with a golf club, would be the relaxation of the system to allow the summation and the whip effect of the body. So, strength is then a conversation of timing as well as the raw grunting contraction or the energy storage and release in through the tissues of the body. It really is about timing through the kinetic chain.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because when we talk about timing and you talk about the summation of forces, particularly in such an integrated triplane movement such as throwing a baseball,
yep,
or the golf swing, or hey, even when you do a power clean,
yep,
you don't see the summation of forces that's almost like this bell-shaped curve. you see this double dip. Because you stated earlier, it's a timing, and you have to have that relaxation moment to allow the muscles to eccentrically load. That relaxation moment is that brief stabilization and then that explosiveness.
Yeah.
In fact,
And McGill's done work on this too, hasn't he?
I was going to say, Stuart McGill just did a fabulous presentation in Chicago at the Perform Better Summit, and he showed not only on video, but he had a comparative, or he also had a coinciding EMG that showed that double dip. Well, I know that working with golfers on the backswing, we just don't go here and then force it through. There's that momentary lapse that gravity just takes in and allows everything to settle in. And then when you look at the control of the mass and the momentum, then it's that timing and the summation of forces that creates the greatest amount of output. You look at boxers, it's the same way. They're just not constantly loading unloading with a punch. There's a rhythm to it, a relaxation, and then a counter.
Yeah.
That's how the body works in these series of summations.
And this is the one thing that we're looking at quite a bit, is the idea of timing and the idea of what the muscle is doing. And I think unfairly, we learned and perhaps we taught that a muscle turning on is the best thing that we could ever achieve for a muscle. And as we start to vet more and more research, and you stated it perfectly, when you look at the actions of the muscular system in conjunction with the skin, the connective tissue, and the bony segments of the body, all these things are in flux. But when we think about a moving body, in even the idea of power and force generation, the muscle's ability to be sensitive to turning on and off is critical for the success of the body, of the task at hand, if we want to call it a strength task. And so, for us, looking at timing is becoming more and more and more important, as opposed to simply turning on a muscle and trying to get that sucker to contract with all its might.
No question. And when you think about this, though, that's where we need to go back and make things a bit more remedial.
Initially, you mean?
Initially, yes.
Yeah.
Initially. Because not only is it a timing factor, but what it also is in some respects a mobilization factor.
Yeah.
So what we need to do, and I keep referring back to the big movement rocks, we need to look and make sure that the ability to mobilize, when you mobilize, there's also going to be that deceleration aspect, to have the absorption come through forefoot, ankle, hip, and thoracic spine.
Yep.
Because we've got this recoil tendency, this almost like this coiling and unloading. So we need that mobility, but then we need to just slowly learn to get the rhythm, as I tell the athlete or whomever I may be working with. Let's get the rhythm first and just learn the movement pattern before we push speed and explosive.